Dr. Lake is professor of preaching and Adventist studies at Southern University, and he's been for the past 19 years. He's a graduate of Southern University, and he was baptized to the church by Ken Cox as a teenager. And he's author of the book Ellen White Under Fire. So without further ado, I am going to turn the program over to him.
Good morning. Pleasure to be with you. Is my mic on? It sounds like it is, so I can walk and you can still hear me. Excellent. Yeah, it's always fun to come from the classroom into the church. It's a different setting and a fun one. I'm glad to be here with you this morning. I have 3 presentations today. The first one will be on Ellen White as a person. Will the real Ellen White please stand? What was she like? We often think of Ellen White as the prophet, but what was she like as a person, as a human being, the personal side? And then during the church service, I want to address the very important issue of Ellen White's relationship to the Bible, her prophetic gift and Scripture. Then in the afternoon, when we'll be challenged after a potluck to stay awake, I will talk about interpretation, how to read Ellen White correctly, interpret her. That is a very important issue that so many of us as Seventh-day Adventists need to experience and understand and to really appreciate those writings. So that will be my focus with you today. Well, let's get started with my subject now. Will the real Ellen White please stand? There are very many negative caricatures on Ellen White on the internet. In fact, that's an area that I specialize in. My book, Ellen White Under Fire, deals with critics of Ellen White. And I saw this image online some years ago, St. Ellen, with the halo around her head and the negative caricature of her holding the heavy Bible up, a famous story about Ellen White. And sometimes she's viewed this way even within the church by supporters. This one's an even more negative caricature where they've imposed the face of Ellen White on the Pope, the implication being that some Adventists lift up Ellen White in such a way that she's considered to be the Pope, the leader and the final word in everything regarding the church. And that, of course, is a very negative and untrue caricature of Ellen White. You've got numerous anti-Ellen White books with the white word in the titles. The White Lie, that was Walter Ray's famous book regarding the plagiarism charge. And my purpose is not to talk about the critics of Ellen White today and deal with the criticisms. That, of course, is another set of presentations. But you've got books like The White Lie, Whitewashed, White Out. All of these are very negative books that criticize Ellen White, and I address these in my book and elsewhere. And even within our own ranks, probably the classic Sister White Says, where Ellen White is used like a hammer to bang people over the head. And many Adventists in past generations have grown up with Sister White says you should do this and Sister White says that. And that creates an oppressive atmosphere when she's used that way. And that's something she struggled with. She despised it when her people used her writings that way, as a hammer to bang people over the head. So this is not the real Ellen White. When you look at her life and her writings, and you read her writings holistically, you find quite a different picture than she's often portrayed. Interestingly, she's a forgotten figure of history. Many historians outside of the Adventist community are just now recognizing the significant contribution Ellen White made regarding religion in the 19th century America. I was at a meeting some years ago with historians, not only Adventist historians, but historians outside of the Adventist circle, and they were quite interested in Ellen White. And she seems to be a forgotten figure in history, and hopefully that will change as people learn more and more about her. But our focus now is the real Ellen White. What was she like? Will the real Ellen White please stand? She was a visionary, church leader, public speaker, prolific author. That's how we usually think of her. But she was also a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and a friend to many people. That's the personal side of Ellen White I want to talk to you about. I'll talk about her as a prophet later on today in my other presentations, but now as the person, as the mother, as the grandmother, as a wife, she had extraordinary visionary experiences where she saw many incredible things. But as a person, she was a human being like us who made mistakes. She did not walk 3 feet off the ground. She was a human being who had her ups and downs in life. Let's look at her family background. Her parents were of British ancestry, sturdy New England stock. That's an important point. In recent years, there has been a claim that Ellen White had African American blood in her background. And if that is the case, that's fine. But the White estate wanted to get the facts right, so over the years they've hired genealogists to study her background. In fact, there's been 2 major studies, and they have found that her background is clearly of British ancestry, sturdy New England stock, and if in the future there was some evidence that she had African American in her background, that's no problem. It's just getting the facts right. Her father was Robert F. Harmon. He was a farmer, a hat maker. Ellen was born in Gorham, Maine, and then the family later moved to Portland, Maine, the big city of Portland. I conduct Adventist Heritage Tours, New England tours in the fall, and I always take my students to Portland, and we spend a day there. A lot of Ellen White sites are there. We also go to Gorham, Maine, and we've discovered the precise location of her birthplace, and we go there as well. Her mother was Eunice Gould Harmon. That's where we get the Ellen G, the G in Ellen G. White. Eunice Gould Harmon. She was a housewife and homemaker, and her mother played a vital role in Ellen's early conversion experience, in which I will show you in a moment. They were members of the Portland, Maine Chestnut St. Methodist Church. Robert was a deacon there, and during the Millerite movement, when William Miller was proclaiming the soon coming of Jesus and the Millerite movement reached its peak in 1843, that's when pastors began to disfellowship the Millerites from their churches. And it was in September of 1843 that the Harmon family, Ellen's family, they were ousted or disfellowshipped from their home church, the Methodist Episcopal Church. That was the version of John Wesley's church in America. And that was a very difficult experience for the family. A friend and colleague of mine in Adventist studies at Andrews University, Merlin Burt, went down to the basement of this church when it was still a church. It's not a church anymore. The building is now a restaurant, but it's not a church anymore. But when it was a church, he went to the basement and studied the papers, and he found that the first family that was disfellowshipped because of the Millerite ideas was the Harmon family. So that had to have been a very embarrassing, humiliating experience for them. Ellen's siblings took it hard, especially one sibling, her fraternal twin. I'll explain that more in a moment. But they were disfellowshipped for accepting the Millerite theological positions. That, of course, led up to the famous Day of Disappointment on October 22, 1844, a vital date in Adventist history. Her siblings, among them, she had 5 sisters, including a twin, and 2 brothers. Let's talk about them. Her oldest sister was Caroline Harmon, who married into the Clow family. Her husband was a Methodist clergyman. Now, in the early years, several of Ellen's sisters would travel with her as she shared her visions, and they were very supportive of her prophetic gift. But in the end, they never accepted the Sabbath and the 3 angels' messages. When the Adventist church was established, they never became a part of it. So Caroline, her oldest sister, married a Methodist clergyman. Here's a picture of Ellen at age 44 and Caroline at age 60. Ellen had a close relationship with her sisters. And even though a number of them never accepted her faith, it's interesting that Ellen White embraced her sisters. She said, "We have differences," in a letter one time, "but our hearts are one." And here's a very important point I make to my students and to audiences when I share this. Ellen White embraced the Christianity of her sisters. Although they never accepted the Sabbath and the three angels' messages, she still believed they were Christians. And it appears from everything she said about them, she expected to see them in heaven. I think that's a great lesson for us. Sometimes as Adventists we tend to ostracize ourselves from other Christians and they're Babylon. But you don't find that with Ellen White. While theologically she certainly spoke strongly against the Protestant world rejecting the law of God, but in a personal level she was very friendly to Christians of other faiths. And she accepted their Christianity and believed that God was still working with them. You find that repeatedly in her personal life and her friendliness towards other Christians. What a lesson for us. I think we should be friends with our Baptist and Methodist brethren and sisters, don't you? We get that lesson from Ellen White. Harriet Harmon McCann also married the wife of a clergyman in Kansas. These were Methodist. The Methodists were very close to Adventist. Ellen and her whole family came out of the Methodist faith. And so it's no small wonder that her sisters married Methodist clergymen. Methodists were very involved in the Millerite movement. One of her brothers, John B. Harmon, was a businessman in Illinois. Now, Mary Plummer Harmon Foss married Hazen Foss' brother, who also was an interesting figure in Adventist history. Mary did accept the Seventh-day Adventist beliefs as they progressed and became the Seventh-day Adventist. She accepted the beliefs but never became a baptized member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Sarah Harmon Belden did become a Seventh-day Adventist, so a couple of Ellen's siblings did become Seventh-day Adventist. The other one was her brother Robert F. Harmon, Jr., the only brother to become a Seventh-day Adventist. Unfortunately, he died with consumption at the age of 27. Consumption was a disease then. We call it today tuberculosis. Then they called it consumption. It consumed the individuals. They had no antibiotics at that point. And when people had tuberculosis or consumption, they were generally, to use a 19th century euphemism, marked for the grave, which meant this person is going to die in the near future. Ellen's twin, her fraternal twin, was Elizabeth. She nicknamed her Lizzie. That's what she called her, Lizzie. They grew up together. Lizzie married Reuben Bangs, a Portland, Maine grocer. Reuben was a Quaker, an inactive Quaker. Now Lizzie, interestingly, rejected not only the Methodist faith, but all Christianity. And Ellen's grandson, Arthur White, who managed the White estate, the son of William C. White, during much of the 20th century, he remembers hearing his father say that as far as Ellen could tell, she didn't expect to see Lizzie in heaven. But it was not because Lizzie never became a vegetarian or accepted the Sabbath, but Lizzie rejected Christianity. It appears that when the family was disfellowshipped from their Methodist church, remember the girls were young, they had all their network of friends. They lost all those friends. It was very hard for Lizzie. She took it the hardest. And it appeared to be a wall between her and God. And as she grew older, she rejected all of Christianity, whereas the other sisters remained in Christianity. And that's why Ellen said she didn't expect to see Lizzie in heaven. In a little bit, I will show you or read to you a letter Ellen wrote to Lizzie on her deathbed. She appealed to Lizzie to come to Christ. I'll read that to you in a little bit. I've got to watch my time, though. There's so much interesting information. I get carried away and share all these stories, and if I do, I'll go way past 9 or 10:20, so I've got to resist and make sure I'm done on time. So I won't be able to share all the stories that I usually share. Here's a picture of Ellen and Lizzie. There's Lizzie and Ellen, and a little bit difference in the face because Ellen experienced an accident that disfigured her face. And at age 9, Ellen Harmon suffered a tragic accident. If most of you probably know this story, in which she later wrote, was to affect my whole life. She was struck in the nose by a stone hurled by a classmate angry at some childish trifle. She had this little argument with this girl. Ellen loved going to school. And in this argument, she and her sister were trying to get away from this girl. The girl was most likely, as far as we can tell, not a malicious person. And she never meant to hurt Ellen. And so as Ellen and her sister were skirting on ahead, the girl picked up a rock and hurled it at them, probably thinking she would just scare them. She didn't realize that her aim was off a bit. And Ellen, as she was walking with her sister, she turned to see where the girl was, and the rock hit her right in the face and knocked her out. She woke up, and she vaguely remembers this, more from what others told her later. She was in a grocery store, and she was on the floor. Her dress was soaked in blood. There was blood on the floor. And normally in a condition like that, today, you would stabilize a person, their head and neck, and take them on a stretcher into the hospital to not intensify the trauma. But in this case, they picked Ellen up, and the two girls, probably the girl that threw the rock, they walked her back home. Well, that, of course, intensified the trauma, and she went into a coma for 3 weeks. And she said she laid in a great cradle constructed especially for her, as people told her later, many additional weeks. She said, "I was reduced almost to a skeleton. Her personal physician and family did not expect her to live. She was marked for the grave," as they said in the 19th century. Her own father had been on a trip when the accident occurred. He came back and he looked into this cradle. He saw his little Ellen. He didn't even recognize her. Her face was so swollen and disfigured. Convinced that she was dying, the young 9-year-old Ellen gave her heart to Jesus in simple faith. Several months later, on January 25, 1837, a dramatic aurora borealis lit up the New England sky. This, of course, is a phenomenon that occurs in the north with the lights in the sky. And I researched and found that this particular event was well known and reported in the newspapers. It was a particularly dramatic display of the lights. And when that happened, Ellen remembered neighbors outside the house screaming that the end of the world was upon them. And Ellen's mother picked her out of bed and brought her to the window. But for Ellen, she believed this was the second coming of Jesus. She believed Jesus was going to come and deliver her from all of her suffering and misery. And so she looked to those lights and she waited throughout the night for Jesus to come, but the lights eventually faded. And she later wrote, "But I was disappointed." She later recalled, "The singular appearance faded away from the heavens, and the next morning the sun arose the same as usual." The prospect that she must continue living in the midst of her suffering extinguished Ellen's short-lived childlike joy, and she plunged into great disappointment and depression. Over the next 4 years, in fact, she struggled with discouragement and chronic depression. Physicians today would diagnose her as chronically depressed. I emphasize this to young people. As a teenager, she experienced the depths of clinical depression. Because of her poor health, she could not return to school and gave up her hope of an education, something she very much desired. Ellen loved school. In fact, later in life, she was on a train, and a woman behind her recognized her and said, "I remember you. Your name is Ellen, isn't it? I remember back in school in Portland. The teacher loved, whenever she needed somebody to read the textbook, she would call on you because you could read it better than anybody else." So that shows you what a good student Ellen was and how hard it was for her to never be able to go back to school. "I was unreconciled to my lot," she wrote, "and at times murmured against the providence of God in thus afflicting me." So that original conversion experience dissipated, and she lost a sense of knowing Jesus and salvation. In fact, her conversion experience, as it's been studied by scholars, one of my colleagues has found that there was a 3-step conversion experience. The first step was when this rock hit her, but she lost that. Her conscience was unusually sensitive, and she experienced strong feelings of guilt over her resentment. Her simple faith in Jesus disappeared, and she was left in darkness. This feeling was compounded by her belief in an eternally burning hell, which exacerbated her fear and agony of soul. The Methodist Episcopal Church had a lot of correct teachings that they derived, of course, from John Wesley, who Ellen White greatly respected and followed in her thinking and theological thought over the years. But one issue that they had wrong was eternal burning hell. Ellen White grew up to believe that, and now it caused her great emotional turmoil. She wrote about it later, reflecting on its impact on her life at this point. In my mind, the justice of God eclipsed His mercy and love. The mental anguish I passed through at this time was very great. I had been taught to believe in an eternally burning hell. And as I thought of the wretched state of the sinner without God, without hope, I was in deep despair. I feared that I should be lost and that I should live throughout eternity a living death. The horrifying thought was ever before me that my sins were too great to be forgiven and that I should be forever lost. When the thought took possession of my mind that God delighted in the torture of His creatures who were formed in His image, a wall of darkness seemed to separate me from Him. When I reflected that the Creator of the universe would plunge the wicked into hell, there to burn through the ceaseless rounds of eternity, my heart sank with fear. And I despaired that so cruel and tyrannical a being would ever condescend to save me from the doom of sin. I thought that the fate of the condemned sinner would be mine, to endure the flames of hell forever, even as long as God Himself existed. Almost total darkness settled upon me, and there seemed no way out of the shadows. That was a very discouraged young woman. She also read devotional books from the church library that described little girls as living saintly lives free from doubt, sins, and weaknesses. That was typical of 19th century literature. They portrayed children, the religious literature, portrayed children as saintly little beings who never sinned. Of course, that was very far from reality. But Ellen, in her young mind, thought that's how she should be. And she saw that she couldn't live up to that, so she was plunged into deeper discouragement, disappointment, and depression. Fortunately, a breakthrough in her spiritual experience occurred at the Buxton, Maine Methodist camp meeting late in the summer of 1841. Now, these early Methodist camp meetings were quite different from what we imagined. There was shouting and clapping, waving of hands, and very charismatic in their worship. This is where Ellen White had her conversion experience. Upon hearing a convicting sermon on righteousness by faith, Ellen cried out to God for salvation. This was the second stage of her conversion experience, and this would last for the rest of her life. She described it this way: as I knelt and prayed, suddenly my burden left me. My heart was light, and I can never forget this precious assurance of the pitying tenderness of Jesus towards one so unworthy of His notice. Her sense of unworthiness disappeared as she looked at Jesus and realized that His perfect life was put upon her account. She experienced the beauty of justification by faith, the second stage in her conversion experience. In this stage, she received assurance of salvation. This lasted for the rest of her life. And as she learned new truths over the years, one truth she was glad to drop by the wayside, or one false error, I should say. One of the new truths was that eternal burning hell was not true. That the wicked burn up. They don't burn always. And that fit with her theology of the judgment and the Christ's second coming and the millennial judgment. And that was a doctrine she was happy to drop by the wayside. That would come in future years as they studied after the disappointment. But this assurance of salvation became a vital component of Ellen's experience. The culmination of her conversion was a counseling session in 1843, initiated by her mother with an Adventist Methodist minister named Levi Stockman. When I say Adventist, I mean the Millerite Adventists. They were looking for the blessed hope. They weren't Seventh-day Adventist yet. That would come. just Adventists now, looking for the blessed hope. Levi Stockman was a Millerite minister, and he was dying of consumption or tuberculosis. Ellen had consumption as well. And in this interview, they both coughed their way through it. And Stockman was a very spiritual man. In fact, it was Ellen's mother who set this interview up because she felt Stockman could really counsel young Ellen well, and he did just that. He told her, as she shared her experience with him, how he felt God had some special plan in mind for her. And that brought great encouragement to her soul and moved her. And that evening she went to another Methodist camp meeting and experienced the second blessing the Methodists called. That was the experience of sanctification. That was the third and final phase of her conversion experience. And it lasted her through the very disappointing Millerite experience, the great disappointment. But she maintained that assurance that God had saved her and Christ was with her and was sanctifying her through His Spirit. And that would, of course, carry over as she learned the new truths of the Advent movement and Sabbatarianism in the years to come. In December of 1844, she experienced her first and formal vision, in which she saw the people of God walking on this narrow path. And with the bright light before and after them, and people falling off the paths. That was the beginning of 70 years of prophetic ministry, over 1,000 visions she had. This was, of course, the very beginning of that experience. That was her prophetic experience. But let's continue looking at the personal side of her life. Here's an early picture of Ellen at age 30. You can still see signs of the accident. We don't have a picture of when she was a teenager. Probably for years her face was swollen and more disfigured. As she got into early adulthood, things smoothed out. But still you can see the evidence of that in her nose. Do you think if Ellen were around today, do you think she would get a makeover? Probably not. That was not important to her. But she lived with the effects of this on her face as well as her physical stature for the rest of her life. Or I should say physical stamina. She married James Springer White on August 30, in 1846. He had traveled with her in some of her, to hear her early visions, and they caught one another's attention, and they discussed marriage. They thought Christ was coming, but then they realized they could do more work for the Lord together, so they got married at a simple justice of the peace. No big wedding for our pioneers. A simple ceremony in front of a justice of the peace. He was 25 and she was 18, but they had a long and successful marriage, although they were human beings like us. Let me say something here. This is the earliest picture we have of James and Ellen. This is a bit distorted, but that's how they looked early in their marriage. They were humans like all of us, and so their marriage had its ups and downs. And years later, after James had several strokes, he became cantankerous and irritable and critical, and they had some issues in their marriage. And there was at one point where she was on the West Coast in California, he was on the East Coast in Battle Creek. He was insisting that she come back to Battle Creek and go with him on a camp meeting tour, and she says, "I don't think so. I think the Lord wants me to stay here." And the struggles they had were quite intense. And they decided for a while they could do more for the Lord separate. So there was a small separation there at this point. And you read this series of letters that took place. I don't have time to read them to you, but they had some real struggles and challenges. And James was upset at her. You know, it had to be a challenge to be married to a prophet. But she was also upset at him. He was really criticizing her. And it went back and forth. But in the end, Ellen apologized to James. And they reconciled. And in a few short weeks, she was back on the East Coast, traveling with James in camp meeting. They remained happily married until he died in 1881. But they had a real marriage, just like the rest of us, with its ups and its downs. And you would really be interested if I had time to read you some of those letters and see how real they were. They had 4 children. This is their firstborn, Henry. Two of their children died. Henry died at age 16 of pneumonia. Very sad story, very difficult for the family. Henry could sing well. Ellen said after he died, "Our home is so lonely and quiet. Oh, how we miss our sweet singer." Henry was a talented young man. I often wonder if he had lived, the contribution he would have made to the church. On his deathbed, he reached out to all of his friends and appealed to them to come to Christ. The year before he died, he was enamored with the soldiers. This is during the Civil War period. And I'll say more about the Civil War and that historical background this afternoon when I talk about interpretation. But Henry was enamored with the soldiers, and at one point he would go close to Battle Creek where they were marching and training for battle. He would march with them and whistle. And the captain liked his whistling so much that he told the flute players to stop, and the soldiers marched to Henry's whistling. And he wanted to join the army as a drummer boy. But his parents, of course, discouraged that. They were pacifists. They were greatly concerned. And out of respect for his parents, he decided not to do that. And James quickly moved his family away from Battle Creek because Henry and his brother Edson and even little Willie were very interested in the military. And of course, James and Ellen did not want them involved in any way, shape, or form in the war. The other son that died, little John Herbert, died of a terrible disease that affected the skin, erysipelas, and James had to conduct the funeral of his own son. Very discouraging point. The two children that lived on, shown in this picture here, this is right after the Civil War in 1865, little Willie and Edson. Let me say a few words about these two boys. Here's the young Edson and the older Edson. These children were very interesting. Edson was the bad boy, if you will. Edson didn't obey anything his mother said. Ellen White wrote against reading fiction of the day. Edson read fiction. He read it all. Ellen talked about modesty in dress. Well, Edson saved up his money and spent a month's salary of the average worker on a fancy suit and a watch with an ornament hanging on it. And with that, he paraded up and down the street in front of the Review and Herald office. And he also sat in church. His mother wrote about Edson would sit in church. He would lay his head back, prop his feet on the pews, and take a nap during the sermon, sitting next to Prophet Mother. So this was quite challenging. Now, Ellen wrote many epistles to Edson. Many letters to him. I'm going to share with you an excerpt from one. And she wrote here to Edson about his disposition to disobedience. And I want to show you here that Ellen was not a perfect parent. She would write about parenting years later, not only from visions she had experienced, but her own experience of trial and error. She wrote to Edson, one of the many epistles. Wrong page. Here we go. She said, "You not only disobeyed us yourself, but led Willie, who was 5 years younger, to disobedience. A thorn has been planted in my heart from that time when I became convinced that you could not be trusted. A gloom which I cannot express shrouds our minds in regard to your influence upon Willie." So you can see, as a parent, she was discouraged with Edson. "This influence we have seen has affected our noble-hearted, truthful Willie." Now listen to what's going on here. And by the way, Edson's personality was different from his mother. But little Willie and his mother were like two peas in a pod. Their personality was alike. "You do things and enjoin upon him strict secrecy. When questioned by it, he evades by saying, 'I don't know,' when he does know. Thus you lead him to lie in order to keep concealed your cherished darling projects. Oh, Edson, it is the knowledge of these things that is wearing me out and bringing upon me discouragement, which will compel me to cease laboring in the cause of God. You had so little sense of the true value of character. You seemed as much pleased in the society of Marcus Ashley." Now that was one of his bad boy friends. "Marcus Ashley as with your own innocent brother Willie." And she wrote of Willie, "He is a treasure, beloved of God, but I fear your influence will ruin him." Not a good idea. In fact, this contrast between good Willie and bad Edson would be a claw in Edson's side the rest of his life. He grew up resenting his brother. She went on to say, "My poor Willie, I see no way for us but to cease traveling and do what we can to save our own children." So Ellen struggled in her own parenting. Things worked with Willie, but nothing worked with Edson. Edson grew into adulthood. He married a woman that his parents did not want him to marry. In fact, Ellen wrote at that time, "Your father weeps over your case." In his late 30s, about his early 40s, Edson had had enough of everything. Like a jab, he wrote a strong letter to his brother Willie and said, "I'm done with not only Seventh-day Adventism, I'm done with Christianity." Willie, of course, shared that with his mother. She went into orbit, as you can imagine. But she had had a dream about Edson. Saw him in a sinking boat. She wrote another epistle to him after many over the years. But this time she appealed from her heart to Edson. But it's interesting how she began that letter. Often her letters were typed, but some letters that she did not want the typist to read were in her handwriting. This was one of them. She put at the beginning of the letter, "Edson, please read this carefully. Do not cast it aside or burn it." Evidently, he had burned previous letters. She said, "I do not want to put it in the hands of the typist." Now, I won't take time to read the letter, but she appealed to him in a way that only a mother can. It moved his heart. Edson gave his heart to the Lord. He wondered how he could contribute to the church. And in the next several years, he discovered that the South was opening up now. It was years after the Civil War. The Reconstruction period was over. Northerners could travel in the South now safely. And he wanted to go down to the South and minister to the blacks, and that he did. And he pioneered the work in the South and the blacks. So he made a significant contribution to the cause of God. He still struggled. He never learned to handle his finances well. And when Ellen died, part of her estate was used to pay off Edson's debts. So that's Edson. Now Willie. Well, I'm struggling with the time here because I'm just wondering how many stories I can tell you and how many I can't. But about Willie, I just got to tell you this one. There's little Willie and older Willie. When Willie was a boy, shown in the left side, he attended Battle Creek School and he did not like his teacher. One day after school, he stuck in through the window and he went to the chalkboard and scribbled a poem about his teacher he disliked. The next morning, the children and the teacher read this on the chalkboard. "The devil flew east, west, north, and south, and picked Miss Jones up in his mouth. When he saw he had a fool, he dropped her here to teach this school." Willie White. Yeah, now, real quickly about the old Willie, and of course he got in trouble for that. That was a rare incident. As I said, Willie tended not to get in trouble, and this was a rare time. This didn't happen always, but that certainly stands out, doesn't it? As an adult, and by the way, when James died, Ellen was shown in vision that Willie would be the one to help her in her writings. And he did that. He managed her editorial staff. And when she died, Willie began the work of the White Estate. He was the first director of the White Estate. Willie was one of these people that could go to sleep any place, anywhere. And one time when Ellen White was preaching, Willie was sitting behind her and she was sharing a solemn message. And she noticed some of the audience, they were smiling. And they were looking beyond her shoulder. And so she turned, and sure enough, Willie's beard was on his chest. He was sleeping. She turned back around, and all their faces, or all the smiles on their faces disappeared. They thought, oh, he's in trouble now. And she said, you know, when Willie was a baby, and I would preach at the big pulpit at the Tabernacle Church in Battle Creek, the brethren constructed a little cradle where I could put baby Willie in it. And as I was preaching, I could rock him with my foot, and he would sleep through my sermon. Well, as you can see today, he's not gotten over the habit. And of course, they appreciated that, and she used a little humor in the pulpit. Ellen White was not opposed to appropriate humor in the pulpit, and she loved humor in her life. And if I can get done in time, or I may fit in a couple of stories about her humor. Here she is in her late 30s, and here she is at 48 years old. I'm going to move fast because of my time. This is a picture she loved to share here. And here is her sister Lizzie, and she said I was going to read something there. I think I'll just summarize it. But she wrote this moving letter. Lizzie was on her deathbed. And Lizzie and her husband had one child who had died, and so they experienced a lot of grief. And so Ellen was appealing to Lizzie. She didn't say to her, you need to become a vegetarian, you need to accept the Sabbath, you need to become an Adventist member. She said, Lizzie, don't you know that Jesus wants to take you in His arms and save you? Amen. Lizzie, all you need to do is come to Jesus just as you are, and He will accept you. Amen. That's the evangelist Ellen White, appealing to her sister to come to Jesus. But unfortunately, as far as she could tell, Lizzie died without ever accepting Christ. That's why she said she did not expect to see Lizzie in heaven, because Lizzie did not accept Christ. Of course, a great disappointment to Ellen. Here she is in the year 1881, the year James White died, a year of great grief for Ellen. As I said, they had struggles in their marriage, but overall they loved one another dearly. And when James died, it was a time of great grief for Ellen. Here she is in May of 1888, here holding a Bible in this picture. That's a famous year of the 1888 General Conference that would take place that fall, dealing with righteousness by faith. Here is a picture of Ellen seated at her home in Australia when she was there the last decade of the 19th century. Here is her pet dog, watchdog in Australia. She named after the evil Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser. Ellen White, as I said, enjoyed humor. Her grandchildren, as they grew up, remembered while she lived in Elmshaven the last 15 years of her life, whenever something struck her as funny, they would hear her belly laugh over the whole house. If they were out in the yard, they would hear her laughing. My favorite story about Ellen and humor is when she was coming home from Australia with her daughter-in-law, May, who had an infant child. And an Adventist group had emerged on the island of Samoa. So they stopped by the island of Samoa. Ellen insisted she wanted to visit these believers. And they had to get out of the larger ship into a smaller boat. She and May went up to the shore. It was on the beach. And two hefty men from Samoa walked up to greet them. Of course, they didn't have much clothing on because it was a tropical environment and they were hot and sweaty. And the two men locked their arms into a seated position and they motioned for Ellen to get in their arms. And they picked her up and they brought her on to a rock on the beach and set her there. And she's watching what was happening towards the ocean. And they go back. One of them motions to May to give him the baby, and he has an umbrella, and he would shade the baby with the umbrella. The other man turned his big, sweaty back towards May, and she had her long dress on. The boat is rocking. He motioned for her to get on. Ellen is watching all of this, so she hesitatingly reached her arms around the man and locked her arms there. And he began to walk, and she's bouncing. The water is splashing from behind, and he's sweaty, and she starts to slip, and she scrambles to hold on. And Ellen is taking all of this in. And May would write years later, she's called Ellen Mother White. She said, and Mother White began to laugh, and laugh, and laugh. She laughed so hard at me, she fell off the rock. And when they quickly ran up to pick her up, with her back against the sand, she was still laughing. So that's a picture I like, especially for the young people to get in their heads, is the humorous side of Ellen White. She was a real person. She loved children to come and visit. She would always give them cookies. And I tell my students, you don't want to let this get out of the classroom, but I'm going to let it tell you now. Ellen White had a favorite dessert. Praise the Lord. Oh, no. She loved lemon pie. Now, of course, she ate it in moderation. She didn't eat 3 pieces of lemon pie. She had a simple piece of lemon pie. If I were to go on and talk to you about Ellen White and her personal life, I would show you how balanced the woman really was. It's too many of her followers who are the extremists. Amen. Ellen herself was very balanced in her diet and her advocating careful lifestyle and so forth. Here is a picture of her in 1907 with her family, a happy grandmother with family surrounding her. Here she is at the 1909 General Conference. After James died, Brother Haskell asked her to marry him. She respectfully declined. She felt she could do greater work for the Lord single, which she did. As you know, early in 1915, she fell on her way to her study and broke her hip. She was bedridden the rest of her life. I should say bedridden the next 6 months. And then in July of 1915, she died in the Lord. This was a turning point for the church. As you can imagine, there were 3 funerals, 2 on the West Coast, then the final one on the East Coast. Here is Brother Haskell giving the funeral sermon. A.G. Daniels, the famous General Conference president, gave the life sketch. Here is the graveside service. Look at all the people. This had to have been a turning point for them. I mean, Ellen White had been there from the very beginning. Now she was gone. Adventism would have to go on without her presence, only her writings. You can imagine the thoughts in their heads at the time. Here's the family burial plot in Oak Hill Cemetery. A Bible was made with flowers with Revelation 22:12 inscribed, "Behold, I come quickly, my reward is with me." She was buried next to her husband. Today there's a big wall here and it looks different, but this is the grave site at the time of the funeral. A.G. Daniels, if you know in Adventist history, was the most famous General Conference president, and he summarized Ellen White. I'm going to conclude with this. He gave a great summary of his experience with Ellen White. This high church leader knew her well and worked closely with her for most of his ministerial career. He said this in his book, The Abiding Gift of Prophecy, written years after she died. "In this present year of our Lord, 1935, Mrs. White has been at rest 20 years, while I have been toiling on. I had 23 years of direct observation of her life work. Since her death, I have now had 20 additional years for thoughtful reflection and study of that life and its fruits. Now at an advanced age, with the constraint of expressing only sober, honest truth, I can say that it is my deep conviction that Mrs. White's life far transcends the life of anyone I have ever known or with whom I have been associated. She was uniformly pleasant, cheerful, and courageous. She was never careless, flippant, or in any way cheap in conversation or manner of life. She was the personification of serious earnestness regarding the things of the kingdom. I never once heard her boast of the gracious gift God had bestowed upon her, or of the marvelous results of her endeavors. She did rejoice in the fruitage, but gave all the glory to Him who wrought through her. I realize that these are grave statements, but they come from the deepest conviction and soundest judgment that I am capable of rendering. They are uttered in the sobering atmosphere of my last illness. Daniels was dying as he finished this book and died shortly after it was published. As I faced the judge of all the earth, before whose presence I realized that I soon shall stand. Daniels earnestly believed in Ellen White's prophetic gift. And if I may, let me just read to you something Paul Harvey said about Ellen White. And I will conclude with this statement. Paul Harvey, you remember Paul Harvey, famous news broadcaster. His wife was an Adventist, by the way. He said this on one of his broadcasts in 1997. Women have been honored on American postage stamps for more than 100 years, starting with one woman who was not an American, Queen Isabella, in 1893. Since then, 86 women have been honored, ranging from Martha Washington to Marilyn Monroe. Also many women authors like Louisa May Alcott, Emily Dixon, Willie Cather, Rachel Carson. But I can name an American author who has never been honored thus, though her writings have been translated into 148 languages. More than Marx or Tolstoy, more than Agatha Christie, more than William Shakespeare, only now is the world coming to appreciate her recommended prescription for optimum spiritual and physical health. Ellen White, you don't know her? Get to know her.